For 5,000 years, one question has haunted Egyptology. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And how did an isolated civilization suddenly emerge from the African desert to create the most awe-inspiring monuments in human history? But here's what most people don't realize. The answers were never buried in the sand. They were buried inside us. Inside the preserved remains of the pharaohs themselves. And it took scientists until 2024 to finally crack the code that rewrites everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt. This is the story of how a single molecule, one impossibly fragile strand of DNA, solved Egypt's greatest mystery, revealed a shocking truth about human migration, and forced the world to confront what it really means to be Egyptian. The answer was hiding in the tombs all along. We just needed to learn how to read it. 3 years ago, in a climate-controlled laboratory buried deep beneath the Egyptian National Museum in Cairo, Dr. Zahi Hawass held a vial of dust. Not just any dust, this was the remains of Pharaoh Khufu's lineage, the genetic material extracted from the oldest royal mummies ever successfully sequenced. His hands trembled, not from fear, from the magnitude of what he was about to discover. For decades, Hawass had excavated Egypt's tombs. He had seen the artifacts, read the hieroglyphics, traced the dynasties through papyrus scrolls and tomb carvings, but he had never truly seen Egypt's face, not until science gave him the ability to look directly into the blood of kings. The challenge was almost impossible. DNA degrades. It crumbles under the assault of time, heat, moisture, and bacteria. In most mummies, what remained after 4 or 5,000 years was so fragmented, so contaminated by modern tourists and archaeologists who had handled them over generations, that extracting anything meaningful seemed like chasing ghosts. But in 2020, a breakthrough in ancient DNA technology changed everything. New sequencing methods could read degraded DNA with unprecedented sensitivity. They could distinguish between the authentic genetic material of the pharaoh and the DNA of every person who had ever touched the mummy since its excavation. It was like discovering a new language to read history. The first mummy to be sequenced was Tutankhamun, King Tut, the boy pharaoh who died mysteriously at 18 and whose tomb had remained sealed for over 3,000 years until Howard Carter discovered it in 1922. When scientists extracted his DNA and ran it through the databases, what they found shocked them. Tut was not who the royal lineage suggested he should be. His DNA revealed that his parents were almost certainly siblings. His mother and father had carried recessive genetic traits that, when combined, produced a child whose immune system was catastrophically weak. He suffered from a clubfoot, a bone disorder, and genetic complications that would have made him fragile. For a civilization that glorified the pharaoh as a god, a being of perfection and power, this was almost unthinkable, but it raised an even bigger question. If the royal family was marrying within itself, breeding these genetic weaknesses into the line, where did they originally come from? Who were the first Egyptians? This is where the story becomes extraordinary, because when scientists began sequencing the DNA of earlier pharaohs, older dynasties, mummies from different regions across Egypt, a pattern began to emerge. It was subtle at first, a whisper in the genetic code, but it became louder, clearer, more undeniable with each new sample. The ancient Egyptians were not who we thought they were. They were not a homogeneous civilization that arose in isolation from the Nile Valley. Their genetics told a different story, a story of movement, of migration, of conquest and integration happening thousands of years before written history. The evidence pointed to something remarkable. The earliest pharaohs, particularly those of the Old Kingdom, the architects of the Great Pyramids, carried genetic markers that could be traced to the Levant, the region spanning modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. These were not Egyptians who had evolved in place. They were invaders, settlers, people who had migrated south from Asia, Minor and the Mediterranean coast, bringing with them not just their bodies, but their culture, their building techniques, their astronomical knowledge. The indigenous African populations of the Nile Valley, who had been there for thousands of years before, were gradually absorbed, merged, and integrated into this expanding empire. It was perhaps the greatest population replacement in ancient history, happening so slowly, so methodically over centuries, that it left almost no trace in the historical record, until DNA gave us the ability to read it. But the revelation that shook the scientific community came when researchers looked even deeper, when they examined the genetic ancestry of ordinary Egyptians, not just the pharaohs, but when they analyzed mummies from the working class, from farmers, from artisans, from the hundreds of thousands of people who actually built the pyramids. What emerged was a genetic portrait of stunning complexity. Yes, there were Mediterranean and Middle Eastern lineages, but there was also sub-Saharan African ancestry. There was evidence of populations from Nubia, from deeper in Africa, from peoples who had migrated along the Nile corridor. Ancient Egypt was not a monolithic kingdom. It was a tapestry, a genetic crossroads where African, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern populations had merged over millennia, creating something entirely new. The implications were staggering. The construction of the pyramids, previously attributed to a homogeneous Egyptian culture, had been accomplished by a genetically diverse workforce. The scientific and mathematical achievements, the astronomical alignments, the architectural innovations, all of this had emerged not from a pure, isolated civilization, but from a hybrid society. A place where different peoples, different knowledge systems, different traditions had collided and fused. The mystery of ancient Egypt wasn't the mystery of an isolated genius culture. It was the mystery of how human populations moved, mixed, and created civilization together. Yet there was another mystery lurking beneath this one, a darker, more troubling revelation. As scientists mapped the genetic transitions across different periods of Egyptian history, they noticed something alarming. Between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, roughly around 2180 BCE, the genetic portrait of Egypt shifted dramatically. A new wave of invaders, people from the East, had swept into Egypt during a period of political collapse and chaos. They were the Hyksos, Asiatic peoples who dominated northern Egypt for several centuries. The genetic evidence showed that they had left a mark, a permanent imprint on the Egyptian population. Even as Egyptian kingdoms reasserted themselves, even as dynasties rose and fell, the genetic contribution of the Hyksos remained. It was written into the bodies of millions. It was a story of invasion, of foreign domination, of cultural resistance and eventual integration. And it had been hidden in the DNA for 3,500 years. But perhaps the most stunning discovery came when scientists looked at the DNA of the most famous pharaoh of all, Ramesses II, the great builder, the man who ruled for 66 years, who fathered over one. Researchers found something extraordinary. Ramesses carried genetic markers that were exceptionally rare in ancient Egypt, markers that were more common in populations from the Levant and Mesopotamia. But more remarkably, some of his genetic variants were associated with longevity, with disease resistance, with the biological capacity to father children well into old age. Science could finally explain how Ramesses had lived into his 90s, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world, and how he had continued to produce offspring for decades. His legendary fertility was not merely a matter of cultural polygamy, it was rooted in his actual genetic inheritance. His body, like his monuments, was built to last. The question of where ancient Egyptians truly came from became even more complex when researchers began examining the mitochondrial DNA of mummies. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, and they carry their own small strand of DNA that is passed down exclusively through mothers. By tracing this maternal lineage back through thousands of years, scientists could map the roots of female migration into Egypt, the paths that women and families had taken as they moved across continents. What emerged was a web of connections. Some maternal lineages traced back to Africa, others to Anatolia, still others to the Mediterranean islands. It was as if Egypt was a meeting point for thousands of different family journeys, each one carrying its own story, its own destination, its own role in building civilization. But here's where the story takes a turn toward the future, because understanding where we came from is not merely an academic exercise. It is the foundation for understanding who we are. And who we, countless conflicts and genocides, is revealed as fundamentally false. Every human population is a mixture. Every person alive today carries DNA from dozens of ancient populations, from migrations spanning tens of thousands of years. We are all hybrids. We are all, in a very real sense, the descendants of Egypt. Because Egypt represents something essential about human nature, our capacity to move, to mix, to create something new from diversity. Yet the genetic research also forced science to confront uncomfortable truths about the ancient world. The DNA evidence showed that Egypt's greatest periods of achievement, Greece, the earliest inhabitants of Mesopotamia. Everywhere they looked, they found the same pattern. The great civilizations of antiquity were not the products of isolated peoples perfecting themselves in isolation. They were the products of interaction, trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The very thing that ancient historians and archaeologists had suspected from material evidence, that the Mediterranean and Near East had always been economically and culturally connected, was now confirmed in the DNA itself. Humanity's greatest achievements had emerged not from purity, but from mixture. This genetic revolution is continuing even now. Scientists have recently begun extracting DNA not just from mummies, but from bones embedded in ancient pyramid walls, from the mortar and clay used in, and perhaps most tantalizing, scientists are now exploring whether the genetic knowledge of ancient civilizations themselves might have been encoded in texts. Were the ancient Egyptians aware of their own genetic bloodlines mattered at a genetic level? Whether they understood the mechanism through DNA, or simply observed that certain traits ran in families, the ancient Egyptians were deeply aware of heredity, They were, in a sense, the first geneticists. As we stand at the threshold of the genetic age, where we can now design the traits of future children, where we can edit genes with CRISPR, where we can potentially resurrect extinct species using ancient DNA, the lesson of ancient Egypt becomes increasingly urgent. For 5,000 years, Egypt stood as a monument to human achievement. Now, its DNA reveals something even more profound, that the source of that achievement was not isolation or purity or the dominance of a single people. It was openness. It was mixture. It was the willingness of different populations to meet, to interact, to build something together that none of them could have built alone. Mirror held up to our future. We are all, always have been, a mixture of many origins, and that mixture is not our weakness. It is our greatest strength.